So today I want to show you guys one of the more sort of interesting endgames I've ever had to play out over the board. And namely speaking, this is an endgame where I as white had the two bishops versus the two knights. And this is very interesting because it's sort of one of these positions which, as chess players, we're generally told, right, like the bishop here is very strong. But until you've actually sort of played that out yourself and had this sort of experience, it's sort of just one of those things which you learn to parrot because other players have sort of told you it, and you sort of believe it without really like understanding why that is. And okay, it's like, you know, bishops and long range pieces, especially if there are pawns on both sides of the boards like there are in this position, the position's open. It makes sense, but again, it's sort of like a different thing, knowing that sort of theoretically, and actually being able to execute upon that in practice. And so that's why I want to show you this game that I played last year in the 2022 New South Wales State Open, where in the second round of this tournament, I was playing against an 1800-ish rated player, where not only did I have a big advantage on the board actually, but I also had a big advantage on the clock. My opponent was down to play in the 30-second increment, and I still had about half an hour left. But also just some context for how we even got here this game, we opened with d4, c4, and we went into a Catalan opening, again one of my favorite things to do in chess, and we had the following position where white plays e4, very standard stuff, and black has actually took a bit of a unique move order. Very often black will play knight bd7, then b6, bishop b7, but by playing b6 first you get some extra options, let's say, where you can transpose into the main line by going knight b7 anyway, and then we get the following line, which is very standard for theory. But instead he made use of one of his extra options, which in this position was to play c5. There's also another one, knight a6, which is very interesting, making use of the fact you have not committed your knight to d7, so it can come to this square a6, where sometimes it can come into b4 and do some very active stuff. But anyways, my opponent, again, he played c5 in the game, challenging my center very directly, and a very tempting move might be e5, but you don't really want to play this because, say, after something like knight f7, all of a sudden the center is kind of collapsing for white. e5 is going to be very weak, not actually a position you really want to play. So that's why after c5 I took on d5. I'm happy to open the position up, I take, and black has a bit of an option. They can take with the bishop or they can take with the pawn, but by taking with the pawn you sort of allow this sort of situation where after whatever piece you take back from d5, you're going to have this sort of long-term weakness on c5, which isn't the end of the world necessarily, but understandably my opponent wanted to avoid this, and so he played bishop takes c5, and this was a moment where things started sort of trending towards that position where white has the bishop here, where I play knight b3, hitting the bishop, and my opponent didn't want to retreat, so he played knight a6. This is still definitely playable. I was considering the game, I'd play something like knight d4, just sort of keeping the tension, increasing the pressure along this diagonal. So yeah, again, though we had knight a6, knight takes c5, and just some further normal developing moves. And then we got to this position where my opponent played d takes c4, and he went into this endgame where, again, a lot of players, especially lower-rated players, go into endgames and they sort of think like, okay, I should have pretty good drawing chances in this sort of position. But I was like very, very happy to go into this because, again, I have the long-term sort of advantage of the bishop here. The position is fairly open, and so I felt that, like, despite this being an endgame, the pawn structure is fairly symmetrical. I felt like I should have good chances to sort of win this endgame. And also I should note, by this point the time advantage was already like very much in place. My opponent spent a lot of time figuring out sort of the position before we actually got here. He had 17 minutes left and I had 17 minutes. We started with 19 minutes, by the way. But anyways, he played rook d8, I played h3, just creating a bit of a luff for my king and also maybe stopping any knight g4 things. So he played knight d6, kicking my rook around. I play rook a4, targeting this, and he plays knight d5, actually a very interesting move. I thought during the game he would, in order to protect this a7 pawn, might have to go for something very passive like rook a8, but knight d5 is a very interesting move. Just saying that, okay, you can win a pawn, but I'm going to wreck your pawn structure now. You're also going to lose a bishop here. So I didn't really want to go for this so much. So even though it may be a pawn to pawn, I still wanted to keep that sort of long-term advantage. So I played bishop g5, provoking f6. Now I come back to d2, and it's tough to judge whether this was real provoking or not, because in a way it does give an entrance for the black king to enter in the game a little bit more easily, but at the same time I felt like I was creating some weaknesses, for example on the e6 square, that I could maybe use in the long term. Tough to say though, right? But okay, we saw a5, just keeping the pawn now. I played g4. I think, I can't remember exactly what my idea was behind this move, but I think in some situations, let's say, like, if my rook ever wanted to come back to d4, I was stopping something like knight f5 from hitting it. But anyways, so rook c8, rook d4, rook c4. And initially what I wanted to do in this position was, and by the way, if my opponent plays rook c2 trying to like be very active, I believe this just loses to something like 91, or maybe he can come back and sort of hold things together, but if he tries to get very ambitious, then I believe this just loses a piece. So he couldn't really do that, which is why I was going for the rook exchange. And again, with all his pieces sort of lined up on the d file, I very much want to keep the rooks on the board, but concretely I sort of had issues with it, and this was where practically I was faced with a bit of a problem. Let's say, okay, I want to keep the rooks on, and this move rook d3 concretely doesn't seem so good, because after say like knight e4, he's just gaining a lot of tempi on my pieces. I don't want to let him play knight takes d2, then I lose the bishop here and I basically have no advantage. But if I go backwards, okay, he can't quite play something like knight f4 immediately, like again trying to win back the bishop here, because then I play rook d8 check and I win a piece. But rather if he goes say knight c5 first, attacking my rook while also defending the bishop, then if I retreat, well now knight f4, and I realistically do not see any way to save my bishop whatsoever. Because like say if I retreat for example, then there's going to be this pawn hanging at the very least. So I was like, okay, do I take a gamble and be like, because my opponent has virtually no time left, he's not going to figure this out? But I was like, okay, it makes no sense to do that. These are all like fairly forcing moves, I would say, not the most difficult things to find in the world. I've also spent a couple minutes already, so he's probably been calculating like hell trying to figure that all out. So I was like, okay, let's just make the long-term decision, let's play b3, allow him to make the rook exchange, but what he won't be able to do is just easily win my bishop here, so long-term, I still have some pretty good prospects. And what he ended up doing from here was he played knight c7, again trying to initiate this exchange of the bishops. I do not want to exchange this, and I only have one bishop. And the important thing you need to understand is that when, like, okay, the thing that makes the bishop pair so strong is that you control both color complexes of the board. But when you exchange one of the bishops, then you lose that control over one of them, which in an endgame like this with so few pieces on the board, it basically greatly diminishes your winning chances to, again, basically zero. Which is why in the game, initially I was actually just planning on playing bishop f1, a very typical retreat, just trying to avoid contact between the two bishops. But then I actually realized, like, oh, what? I don't even have to do that. I can just play knight c6, and you know, if I can avoid the trade while being active instead of passive, why not, right? So that's what I played, and after the following moves, I play bishop e3, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn, and he caves and plays bishop takes c6. Whether this was truly necessary or not, maybe a little bit questionable. That's what he did nonetheless. And after bishop takes c6, we get to this position where we have the two bishops versus the two knights. And again, the situation where I have about half an hour on the clock and my opponent has 0 minutes on the clock, where he's basically down to the increment. But this is sort of the first interesting moment of the endgame, I'd say, where, you know, white kind of has the freedom to really come up with what do we really want to do in this position. Black's king is yet to get active, but neither of ours, right? So are we going to activate the king? Are we going to like try harass the knights? That's all kind of up for debate, right? But with this discussion, it's also worth taking into account that knights are very, very tricky pieces. And if we're not careful, like if we just get our king into sort of a danger zone, all of a sudden these knights are going to be giving all sorts of like crazy checks. So we need to be at least somewhat diligent of those sort of scenarios. And in this game, unfortunately, I was not really. I played bishop f4. And already this might have been a step in the wrong direction, where I'm sort of kicking the knight away from this d6 square to a very passive one on c8, because if you go anywhere else, I'm probably going to play like bishop c7 and start attacking your pawns, and thank you very much. But after knight c8, now it defends b6, and strangely enough, there's no way I can actually attack this knight, because this knight's doing a very good job at controlling squares like d7 and b7, and so very naturally I decide, okay, I can't make anything concrete of the position right now, so I'll just bring my king in. And then we got to the following position where, already believe it or not, I sort of mucked up a little bit, where I was just sort of expecting my opponent to play something like knight d6, trying to go for knight e4 checks and stuff, and I was like, okay, given what I said earlier, right, I understand that I need to be diligent of these sort of knight checks. I'm going to play f3, control say the e4 square, and it feels like I'm very much in control of the position, except I did not consider a more dangerous approach from my opponent. Once again, knights are very tricky, where instead of going to the somewhat more active looking d6 square, at least in the surface, he could go to e7, and after this kicks my bishop away, this knight, where from d6 again it didn't have many options, especially once I played this f3 move, right, it can actually come to d5 now, maybe not immediately, but at least this option that sort of he has in hand, and this can be a very unpleasant thing to deal with. And already after bishop b5 check, knight e4 happened, where obviously my king and pawn have been forked, so pretty much I have free legal options: king e2, king e3, king e1. Maybe that's not exactly the definition of legal, but you get what I mean. But obviously one of them fails right off the bat to knight d3 check, forking the king and bishop. If I go this way, then there's these sort of annoying knight c3 things I fall into, where there's going to be all sorts of annoying checks. Maybe also the other one is even quite strong, and the idea being, for example, if I go king d4 now, there's this very strong knight e2 check, forking the king and bishop again, and if I take it, well, this is again the scenario that black has been hoping for. They've traded off one of my bishops, and now the position should be a fairly comfortable draw for them. So in the game, that's why I didn't want to make either of these moves, king e2 or king e3, and thus had to make a bit of a concession going backwards to e1. But even so, after knight d5 still, like, this was a very unpleasant position. My bishop's being attacked. I don't really want to like move it anywhere, because then knight c3 and this are being forked. But at the same time, if I were to like pin the knight with something like bishop c4, at first this was my game plan, then I soon realized that, oh, like b5, and that's actually kind of annoying. And again, the knights are just being so tricky. Now with the help of the pawns, again, I don't really want to take, but I might have to, because what am I going to do? Like, lose my bishop? Probably not, right? So in the game, I end up, what I did was bishop b8. But by the way, I think it's worth just taking a step back and really understanding, where did things go wrong? I think the biggest point actually was in this position, where I should have just played king f1, left the bishop on this e3 square, and not tried to kick that knight away with something like bishop f4, because this bishop on e3 is actually doing a very important role, just putting some pressure on this diagonal, and also protecting the f2 pawn, which means that, like, say if my king ever comes like d2 or c3 or anything like that, there's not going to be any very annoying knight e4 checks, because again, this pawn is going to be protected. One line that I just came up with analyzing a bit earlier was, say we both bring our kings in, black comes to e5, but we can actually just kick him back with something like f4 check, come king c3, and if you plug this into the engine, white basically has a winning advantage, believe it or not, because black is so damn passive. They can't really do anything. If they give a check, well, we're just going to play something like king d4, kick them back further, and maybe, just maybe, we can even consider something like f5 check, king e7, king d5, and this is where you're really just seeing the advantage of the bishop pair come full force. But anyways, coming back to the dreadful existence, which is what I had to face in the game, after king e1, knight d5, I played bishop b8, and you might be thinking, well, Sam, what were you doing after knight c3 then? Because obviously this and this is a bit of a problem. And initially, I think during the game, my sort of plan was to go something like bishop c4 and meet takes with f4, with the idea to go f5 check, kick the king away, and win a piece. But that's very naive, of course, because after knight b4, it's not going to be, I mean, I will get f5 check, but I won't get the winning the piece part. So not really sure what I was planning in that variation, but nonetheless, I went for something slightly different. I ended up playing bishop d3. And I spent a bit of time sort of leading up to this position. By the way, I think by this point, my time advantage very much dried up, because I was having to figure out all these concrete variations. But the whole point was like, okay, I might lose the a2 pawn, but at the very least, I can create an imbalance now where, okay, he's a majority on the queen side, but I have a majority on the king side, and I can potentially give very annoying checks like on g8 and whatnot. I think I still have a lot of pressure in this position. Reality, as it turns out, again, I was a little bit delusional after knight b4. Black is more or less doing fine. Maybe practically there's still chances, but at least objectively, it's just not what it used to be. b5, a4 rather, is coming next. They're going to push the pawn. It's not that easy to stop it. But luckily, chess is a practical game. My opponent sort of bored into my frame here, I guess you could say, and he played g6, thinking that, you know, he can probably still go after this pawn anyway. But what I had in mind in this position was that I could play a4 now, and maybe arguably I should have even done this earlier, because that would have eliminated a lot of hassles I had with b5, right? I could have put a bishop on c4 a lot more easily. But now I realize that sort of maybe opportunity I missed earlier with pushing that pawn. Now I took it, and after say knight b4, I could happily establish my bishop on the c4 square, give him a check. Now after say king d7, f3, I felt like I'd actually properly established like a nice long-lasting positional advantage where I could just happily press for free now. There was also this option bishop g8, and this was probably best, but during the game I couldn't quite figure this out after h5. I was like, okay, if this happens and I just keep chasing the pawn, he's going to go to h4. I don't see how my bishop can just easily win that guy. The computer showed some other things, like in this position you can go say bishop g3 first, stopping the guy, and then you can do the slow dance where you eventually come around and attack the pawn. To be honest, in the game, like say after king e7 stopping bishop f7, that is, I wasn't really smart enough to figure that out, to be honest. But nonetheless, f3 in the game, I still have a decent advantage. He plays knight d5, king f2, and it was at this point I again started fumbling around a little bit. It turns out the best option was actually to reroute the bishop all the way back to h2 or maybe g3 for example, and then when the king tries to come in this way, you can actually slap them with a big fat bishop g1. Amazing, right? Unfortunately, I didn't see that in the game. I played king f2, king c6, and again, what the engine actually wanted to see was bishop h2 and if king d4. The idea is you're going to go like king e2, bishop g1, and if they just keep trying to march into your camp, it doesn't really work because you're going to go g5. And this is actually a really splendid position actually, where after bishop e5 check, f4, believe it or not, black is basically dead and lost, where the king is more restricted than active in your camp, and their knights can't really move for crap because this knight is pinned to defending this knight, and if this guy moves, well, then we can start marching our king in, and this is, again, a very miserable existence for the black pieces. Unfortunately, though, again, I'm not quite a perfect computer. I didn't see bishop h2 and then, like, bishop g1. Very nice idea. I just wasn't on my mind at all. I instead played g5 with a similar idea that after f5 now, I get bishop e5, I cut the king off. Maybe I overestimated the strength of the king coming in here, apparently. But nonetheless, I think this position, by the way, I think what my opponent should have done was probably something like takes, and then like king d4 now. But again, being well in time and a difficult practical situation, my opponent played f5, keeping the pawn structure sort of symmetrical, I guess you could say. And now after bishop e5, again, I felt like I'd sort of made another small accomplishment. I'd stopped black from infiltrating with the king. I'd softened up their dark squares a little bit. And after knight c6, I played bishop g7, maneuvered around a little bit, gave a check, bishop a3. And these last few moves might seem just a little bit like, okay, so what? Like, are we about to agree to a draw or something? We're just moving back and forth now. But I actually view these last few moves as a little bit of a dance going in between black and white, where essentially I cut the king off this diagonal, right? Then they planted the knight here. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going to cut your king off this diagonal now. And your knights actually have a very difficult time moving because this knight is always sort of, you know, restricted in the sense that if it moves, then I'm going to jump on bishop g8. And compared to before, there's just no h-pawn moves. I'm going to be gobbling up all the pawns and then storming my pawns forward. And if you move this other knight, as actually happened in the game, sorry, this one rather, then I'm going to go bishop b5 check. Again, I'm sort of cutting your king off another diagonal now, this one. And now after bishop b2, I'm cutting your knight off of this diagonal. Sorry, I didn't draw the arrow right, this one. So I felt like step by step, I'm slowly creating this small pressure on my opponent. But again, like, what was this perfect? Not really. Like, my opponent, I think, in the game had this small chance, maybe his only chance at this point, to play b5, which I earlier sort of stopped with going a4, but didn't quite in this position because of the active knight in d4. When after takes, he is making that pawn exchange and the position's becoming a lot more difficult to sort of grind out. Now, I'd probably stick it through and play bishop b2. I'm not agreeing to a draw just yet, but definitely it's becoming a little bit more difficult. Nonetheless, so in the game, I got a little bit of a lucky break again with knight c2. That allowed my bishop to jump to this square. And now after king c7, bishop b2, my opponent actually offered a draw, believe it or not, with king d6. And you know, like, fair enough, right? It's been like a 4-hour game already. It's dark outside, like you want to go home. But as a stronger player, what do you do when you're offered a draw like this? You don't accept it. You basically don't, unless like you'll sit there for another 200 moves. You have to try and create as an exaggeration, right? Whether you can even play another 200 moves without the 50 move rule being called, that's another question. But that's the sort of mentality that a lot of higher rated players have when they're faced with these draw offers. It's like, they will fight like hell until the last moment to grind out like that extra half point from the position. And in this one, I ended up playing h5, just making, once again, that pawn break. If you take, my plan is I'm probably going to go like king g3, king h4, or maybe just like bishop e8 and take it that way. Was this perfect? I'm not sure. Like, very often the thing is that from a human perspective, the opponent very often trusts you and they're not going to take because it sort of wrecks their structure. But very often the computer finds a way to sort of justify these like concrete captures. So it wouldn't surprise me if the engine actually liked this move quite a lot. Can't quite remember though. So what happened there was h5 in this position, and not sensing the danger in the position again, my opponent just started moving back and forth at this point. Knight b4, and it makes a lot of sense given he just offered the draw. He's probably also very tired. I play king g3. My idea is that, okay, if I want to do something like takes and bishop e8, attacking the g6 pawn, that runs into knight d3 check, and now I'm losing the piece. So I go king g3 first as sort of prophylaxis, not necessarily to like run my king up the board, although if he takes again, that could be a possibility. So after king g3, what happened was knight c2. But this was just like very, very ignorant of my sort of plans and ideas. For one, I can take, and after bishop e8, go knight e7. And this is where we see one of the powers of the bishop pair really come into play, which is that you can at an appropriate moment, when it makes sense to do so concretely, give one of your bishops up in exchange for, once again, more tangible value in the form of material or a positional factor, in this case material, right, where we're going to be netting the g6 pawn. But to be honest, during the game, it felt a little bit unclear to me. Like, I was like, okay, he goes knight d4, he defends this, he attacks this, and it turns out I was just being completely lazy in terms of my calculation. If I looked one move deeper with king f4, I would have seen that it was all just smokes and mirrors. If he takes this, and these two pass pawns very strong, a4 is sort of holding back his queenside pawns. I can also maybe defend that if he ever goes knight c5, bishop c2, right? Nothing to be worried about. I end up playing the very ambitious h6 though. And again, he was very unaware of my sort of ideas and just played knight e3 in this position. But unfortunately, after bishop e8, the position now collapses, and the idea is simply that I'm going to take and advance my passed pawn. He tried playing king e7, but again, didn't stop anything. Takes h7. He tried after bishop takes g6, giving the check, but just resigned after this position, realizing that unfortunately there's just no way on earth that you can stop my pawn. And so with that, I managed to pull off like an endgame grind, which felt very satisfying. It wasn't perfect by any means. During the game, I didn't know where I went wrong. Only after analyzing, especially like with an engine, was I able to find out like all these small like details as to how I could have been more accurate in my conversion. And so again, like, this video wasn't meant to be some like checklist or, you know, like theoretical framework for how you're supposed to win with the bishop pair. That sort of thing doesn't really exist. At the end of the day, it's like a very practical sort of skill, but I hope just showing you this game and how it wasn't perfect especially gives you some sort of sense of how these endgames play out in practice, and how, and some of the, say, practical obstacles that are going to come with, say, especially playing against the two knights, where like in the game, right, there were like all these tricky check stuff that I had to watch out for, right, and how because I was not careful and alert of like, say, ideas like instead of bringing the knight to d6, something like knight e7 d5, I end up sort of, well, at the end of the day, I didn't really end up paying the price for it, but very well, if my opponent was maybe a little bit stronger and more able to capitalize on some of these small like opportunities, like in this position, if I was playing some of my own rating, they probably would have just taken an a2 and not really trusted me as much, whereas lower rated players sort of like, okay boss, I trust you, I'm not going to let you take on h7, but then of course they end up sort of paying the price for that. Anyways though, that is it for the video. If you found this useful, please leave a like and also subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and also check out some of my other stuff in the description below, coaching, and also my free newsletter. But that being said, hope you guys all have a good day. I will see you until next time.